Imagine a world where poverty, inequality, and exploitation are abolished, where workers own the fruits of their labor, and society is built on cooperation, not competition. For over a century, millions believed this world was not just possible, but inevitable. Yet the dream of communism, born in the fires of revolution and sustained by iron will, would ultimately unravel in a cascade of crises, leaving behind both hope and heartbreak. How did an idea that promised utopia become synonymous with repression and collapse? This is the story of how communism changed the world and why it fell apart. Communism's roots stretch back to the 19th century, when industrialization was transforming Europe. The gap between the wealthy elite and the impoverished working class was growing ever wider. Into this world stepped Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, whose writings would ignite a global movement. Marx, a German philosopher, and Engels, his close collaborator, argued that history was driven by class struggle. In their view, capitalism was just the latest stage in a long process of exploitation, destined to be overthrown by the working class, the proletariat. Their most famous work, the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, called for workers of the world to unite, abolish private property, and establish a classless, stateless society. But Marx and Engels were not the first to dream of a better world. Earlier thinkers, known as utopian socialists like Charles Fourier, had imagined ideal communities based on cooperation and equality. Marx and Engels, however, criticized these visions as unrealistic, arguing that only a scientific understanding of history and economics could bring about true change. The promise of communism was simple yet profound. A world without exploitation, where the needs of all would be met, and human potential could flourish. The first real test of communist theory came in Russia. By the early 20th century, the Russian Empire was a powder keg of discontent. Decades of autocratic rule, economic backwardness, and the devastation of World War I had left the country on the brink. In 1917, revolution erupted. The February Revolution toppled the Tsar, but the new provisional government failed to end the war or address the people's needs. Into this chaos returned Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik faction. Lenin was a committed Marxist, but he adapted Marx's ideas to Russian realities, arguing that a disciplined vanguard party could lead the revolution. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, marking the world's first successful communist revolution. Lenin's government quickly moved to nationalize land and industry, abolish private property, and suppress opposition. The Russian Civil War that followed was brutal, but by 1922 the Bolsheviks had emerged victorious, founding the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. After Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin rose to power, transforming the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state. Stalin's vision was to rapidly industrialize the country and collectivize agriculture, believing this was essential to defend socialism in a hostile world. Collectivization meant forcing millions of peasants onto state-run farms. The process was chaotic and often violent, leading to widespread famine, most infamously in Ukraine, where millions perished. At the same time, Stalin launched a series of 5-year plans to build heavy industry, often relying on forced labor from the expanding Gulag system. Stalin's rule was also marked by terror. The Great Purge of the late 1930s saw hundreds of thousands executed or sent to labor camps, as Stalin eliminated real and imagined enemies within the party, the military, and society at large. The climate of fear and suspicion became a defining feature of Soviet life. Yet despite the immense human cost, the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as a superpower, its victory over Nazi Germany cementing its status on the world stage. After World War II, communism spread rapidly. The Soviet Union established control over Eastern Europe, installing communist regimes from Poland to Bulgaria. This was achieved through a mix of political manipulation, military presence, and the suppression of opposition. In Asia, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, triumphed in a long civil war, founding the People's Republic of China in 1949. Mao's regime would embark on its own radical experiments, including the disastrous Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which caused immense suffering but also transformed Chinese society. Elsewhere, communism took root in North Korea, Vietnam, and, after Fidel Castro's revolution, in Cuba. Each regime adapted Marxist-Leninist principles to local conditions, but all shared a commitment to one-party rule and state control of the economy. The world was now divided. The United States and its allies confronted the Soviet-led communist bloc in a global struggle known as the Cold War. This conflict was fought not just with armies and nuclear weapons, but with ideology, propaganda, and proxy wars from Korea to Afghanistan. Communist regimes relied heavily on Soviet support, military, economic, and diplomatic, to maintain power. In return, they often adopted repressive measures to suppress dissent, justifying them as necessary to defend socialism against Western subversion. Despite early successes in industrialization and education, communist economies faced deep structural problems. Central planning led to inefficiency, waste, and technological stagnation. Productivity lagged far behind the West, and living standards stagnated or declined. Attempts to reform the system often failed. In 1968, Czechoslovakia's Prague Spring sought to create socialism with a human face, introducing political and economic liberalization. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev responded with military force, crushing the movement and reaffirming the limits of reform. The Brezhnev Doctrine was born, a Soviet foreign policy which justified military intervention in communist countries to maintain communist rule. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was in crisis. Growth had slowed to a crawl, and the system was plagued by corruption and denial of reality at the highest levels. In Poland, the rise of the Solidarity movement signaled growing unrest, while in China, economic reforms began to open the door to market forces, even as political control remained tight. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. Recognizing the need for change, he launched perestroika, an economic restructuring policy, and glasnost, a political openness. Gorbachev hoped to revitalize socialism by introducing limited market reforms and greater transparency. But these reforms unleashed forces he could not control. Glasnost allowed criticism of the regime and exposed the scale of its failures. Perestroika failed to deliver economic improvement he had hoped for, leading to shortages and increased discontent. Crucially, Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine, signaling that the Soviet Union would no longer use force to keep Eastern Europe in line. This opened the floodgates for change across the communist world. In 1989, a wave of revolutions swept Eastern Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity movement negotiated a peaceful transition to democracy. Hungary opened its borders, allowing East Germans to flee to the west. In November, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the end of communist rule in Germany and the collapse of the Iron Curtain. Elsewhere, communist regimes fell in rapid succession: Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, where the transition was violent and the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was executed. The Soviet Union, weakened by economic crisis and nationalist movements, began to unravel. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup against Gorbachev, but failed. The momentum for change was unstoppable. By December, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, replaced by 15 independent republics. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The collapse of communism in Europe was remarkably peaceful, given the scale of the transformation. Yet, it left behind economic turmoil, political uncertainty, and a legacy that continues to shape the world today. The transition from communism to market economies and democracy was uneven. Some countries, like Poland and the Czech Republic, made rapid progress. Others struggled with corruption, inequality, and the lingering effects of decades of authoritarian rule. The legacy of communism remains visible in the institutions, cultures, and memories of these societies. Trust in government and civic participation often remained lower in former communist states, reflecting the deep scars left by years of repression. Yet communism did not disappear entirely. In China, the Communist Party remains in power, having embraced market reforms while maintaining strict political control. Vietnam and Laos have followed a similar path. Cuba and North Korea, though isolated and facing economic challenges, have also survived. These regimes have adapted, blending elements of state capitalism, nationalism, and selective reforms to maintain their grip on power. Their continued existence is a reminder that the story of communism is not yet finished. The rise and fall of communism is one of the defining stories of the modern world. Born from a vision of equality and justice, it inspired revolutions, built superpowers, and shaped the lives of billions. Yet the attempt to build utopia by force led to tragedy, repression, and ultimately, collapse. Today, the dream of a classless society endures in some corners, while the lessons of the past continue to provoke debate and reflection. Was communism doomed from the start, or did it fall victim to the flaws of those who tried to build it? If you found this journey through history enlightening, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you might like the channel to cover next. And let's be history together.